Hi there, and welcome to another Health Talk from Marz. It's out of this world. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about specifically eating meat and why eating meat may be really problematic for many people. So stay tuned. So, why is eating meat problematic for people? Well, especially considering in the blue zones, areas in the world where people live the longest of anyone and the healthiest, they do eat meat in most cases. But how much meat do they really eat? Usually they eat about meat once a week, and they eat it more as a condiment than anything else. And the healthiest, longest lived people in the world are the Seventh day Adventists, the vegans, or the pesco vegans, the ones that eat fish once a week and then mostly all plant based diet. So, why is eating meat problematic? Well, let's talk about protein. I did in another episode speak about protein and why protein is not necessarily a good thing. So, what do we know about eating protein? We know specifically eating animal protein increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and osteoporosis. So, animal protein is the number one associated risk factor with regards to these diseases. Interesting enough, we don't see the same correlation with plant protein. Eating plant protein doesn't cause the same problem. Another issue with eating meat has to do with the iron in meat. So if you are iron deficient and you're anemic, eating meat is probably a great thing for you. However, there are millions of people who have what's called hemochromatosis. They store extra amounts of iron in their tissue. These people die prematurely of heart disease, cancer, and inflammatory conditions. Eating meat, if you're one of these people with hemochromatosis, could be deadly for you. So, because it's adding to the toxic burden of iron in your tissues. Okay, what else about eating meat? Well, we know that eating meat gives you a significant amount more of saturated fat and also of arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is a fatty acid that creates inflammation in your body. If you want less inflammation in your body, good idea to eat foods with less arachidonic acid in them. Arachidonic acid specifically comes from eating meat. So there are only small amounts in plant foods. So the other thing that we know is that saturated fat, the Mediterranean diet has shown that saturated fat can be a major cause or is implicated in cardiovascular disease. Ansel Keys did some amazing studies back in the 50s and also in the 60s and 70s to determine that saturated fat can cause problems in the body. Saturated fat in higher levels causes your red blood cells to clump together into something called rouleau formation. Rouleau formation is something that decreases the amount of oxygen that gets to your tissues that can cause fatigue, basically. What's more problems associated with eating meats? Well, one of the things that we know, because of the fat content in meat and because they are higher up on the food chain, they tend to store environmental toxicants much more than other foods. So if you want to avoid environmental toxicants as much as possible, eating less meat is really a good idea. The other problem with eating meat is that all meat contains hormones. People don't really think about the fact that all animals produce hormones. And when you eat animals, you are eating these hormones, and they are bioactive. And so many toxicants we now realize actually are endocrine disruptors at doses in parts per billion. So that's really disconcerting when you consider the significant amount of hormones that are in meats that you consume. The other problem is antibiotics. Currently in the United States, 35 million pounds of antibiotics are used per year. And what we know is that 28 million pounds, or 80% of these antibiotics, are used in livestock. So what's happening is that these antibiotics are getting into the groundwater, going down rivers and streams, going into the ocean, and creating dead zones. So one of the largest dead zones in the world is the Gulf of Mexico, which happens to come at the end of the Mississippi River. The end of the Mississippi River carries various types of toxicants, including antibiotics, into the Gulf of Mexico. So another major concern is glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup Ready. Glyphosate is used to treat genetically modified foods. Genetically modified foods, the vast majority of which are used to feed livestock. So again, if you're eating a hamburger, you're actually supporting the use of more glyphosate. We use 4.5 billion pounds of glyphosate in the world today. Most of that is used in the treatment of animal livestock. So we know that glyphosate has some serious health issues, can cause leaky gut syndrome, and can cause problems with microflora. So trying to avoid glyphosate as much as possible is a great idea. Eating less meat is going to create less glyphosate accumulation in your body. So keep that in mind. So lastly, I want to talk about the environment and eating meat. So people don't really understand the relationship of eating meat and what's happening to our environment. Currently, 200 species are becoming extinct every day because of a number of reasons. One of them is biodiversity and rainforests. So the cutting down of rainforests, especially in the Brazilian rainforest, is a serious problem. So right now, one size of a football field gets cut down every second. And the reason is, the majority of reason, 90% or more, is because they're clearing land to raise cattle and also clearing land to grow genetically modified crops such as soy and corn to feed those cattle. So a hamburger that you eat at McDonald's is supporting the destruction of the rainforest down in Brazil. So either you could eat a hamburger at McDonald's and then cut down all the rainforest, or you could put that hamburger away, eat something that's more plant-based, and preserve that rainforest down in Brazil. It's your choice. Currently in the United States, we consume 206 pounds of meat every year. That's an incredible amount of meat. Nowhere in the world do they eat as much meat as we eat here in the United States. So biodiversity is really critical, and we are losing biodiversity because of all the genetically modified soy and corn that we're growing to feed our livestock. So 97 to 98% of all livestock are raised conventionally. And this is, again, a problem because of the use of glyphosate as mentioned, but also because we are losing land that could be otherwise allocated to wildlife. So most of the large animals are now under serious pressure from the environment losing habitat. And that brings us to fish. Okay, so fish, people think, oh, what I need to do is eat more fish and less in the way of red meat and other types of meats that may be causing cardiovascular disease. Remember that fish also have a lot of protein, and they are animal sources of protein. So that relationship still exists, animal protein from fish and cardiovascular disease and cancer. So what do we know about fish and what's happening to them? Over 90% of the fish stock in the oceans are now very depleted. Some of them are heavily depleted. What we know is that scientists are predicting that there's not going to be any fish in the ocean by the year 2050. According to my clock, that's in not too many years from now. No fish in the ocean means no people on land. So if you do the math, that's a serious issue. Another issue that we have with regards to fish is that what we are seeing are all these dead zones in the ocean, and also we are seeing large patches of garbage. So, one of the largest garbage patches in the world is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So, what they've discovered with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is that the vast majority of that patch is made up of microplastics. So, where are these microplastics coming from? Plastic bottles, plastic containers? No, the vast majority is actually coming from fishing nets. So, people don't realize that fishing nets are sometimes miles long, and when they get old, the boats cut those fishing nets away and they just go into the ocean and expand that Pacific garbage patch that's made up of these microplastics. Now we see all of these microplastics in fish and turning up in all sorts of sea life. And this is something that's definitely not good for us to consume if we're getting these microplastics. As mentioned before, some of these compounds, such as bisphenol A, which is found in these plastics, can disrupt your endocrine system in parts per billion. That's a really small amount. So what we're seeing in terms of people's hormones are out of whack. One of which major reason is probably from these environmental toxicants like bisphenol A and microplastics. So, getting back to eating less in the way of meats, fish is included in that whole picture. And so, when you eat a fish, salmon, somewhere at a restaurant, you're basically supporting the demise of all of the fish in the ocean. It's hard to hear, but it is something that's pretty important to pay attention to. So, anyway, this is some of the most important aspects with regards to eating meat. Eating a little bit is probably okay, like they do in the blue zones, but not how we currently consume meat in the United States. So, happy eating and go plant-based.